Welcome to the Cheating Wife Stories channel. Alexander Sterling's fingers drummed against the leather steering wheel of his Mercedes S-Class as he navigated through Boston's morning traffic. His mind was already at the client meeting ahead, a potential $10 million cybersecurity contract that would push Sterling's shield past its competitors in the government sector. At 42, Alex had built his empire through relentless determination and an unflinching approach to business. His phone buzzed with a message from Victoria. "Good luck at the meeting, darling. Emma's debate competition is at 4. Don't forget." He allowed himself a small smile. Victoria had been there since the beginning, when Sterling's shield was nothing but a dream and a laptop in their cramped Somerville apartment. Now they lived in a historic brownstone on Beacon Hill. Their children attended prestigious private schools, and his company was valued at $50 million. The digital display on his dashboard showed perfect timing. The meeting was giving him enough time to review his presentation one final time. He had insisted Dominic stay at the office for this one. His CFO and best friend since their MIT days was brilliant with numbers, but sometimes too cautious in negotiations. Today required Alex's particular brand of aggressive persuasion. "Siri, call Dominic," Alex commanded, switching lanes. "Alex, I was just about to call you." Dominic's voice filled the car. "The Q3 projections you wanted. Already memorized them. Listen, while I'm in the meeting, I need you to turn green." Alex accelerated through the intersection. His mind focused on the instructions he was giving. He never saw the 18-wheeler barreling toward him. It's the driver's head nodding forward against the steering wheel. The impact came from the driver's side. A horrific screech of metal against metal. Alex's world exploded into a kaleidoscope of shattered glass and twisted steel. The Mercedes spun violently, airbags deploying in a suffocating cloud of white. Time stretched and compressed. Alex was vaguely aware of voices, hands pulling at him. Someone saying, "Stay with us," over and over. He tried to speak, to move, but his body refused to respond. The last thing he heard before darkness claimed him was a paramedic rattling off vital signs, her voice fading like a radio losing signal. Dominic Walsh stood in the emergency room of Massachusetts General Hospital, his knuckles white as he gripped his phone. The call to Victoria had been brief, clinical. Alex was in surgery, multiple trauma, internal bleeding. She was on her way. He paced the waiting room, his tailored suit incongruous among the other worried families. Every few minutes, his phone buzzed with messages from the Sterling Shield board members. News traveled fast in Boston's tech circles. "Dom." Victoria's voice cut through his thoughts. She hurried toward him, her Burberry coat unbuttoned and her normally perfect hair disheveled. "Vic," he caught her arms as she nearly collapsed against him. "They're still in surgery. No updates yet. The children, I didn't tell them. They're still at school. I couldn't." She pressed her face against his chest, her body shaking. Dominic held her perhaps a moment too long before stepping back. "You made the right call. Let's wait until we know more." Hours crawled by. Doctors came and went. Their updates were a mix of medical jargon and cautious optimism. Victoria alternated between sitting rigidly in the uncomfortable chairs and pacing the corridors. Dominic fielded calls from board members and clients, maintaining a facade of business as usual. Finally, Dr. Isabella Morrison emerged from the surgical wing. Her scrubs showed signs of the marathon surgery she just completed. Mrs. Sterling, Victoria, and Dominic both stood. Dr. Morrison's expression was carefully neutral as she delivered the news. Alex was alive, but in critical condition. Multiple fractures, severe internal injuries, and most concerning significant head trauma. "The next 24 hours are crucial," Dr. Morrison explained. "We've placed him in a medically induced coma to help manage the brain swelling, but he'll recover." Victoria's voice cracked slightly. "It's too early to make any predictions. Cases like this can go either way." Dr. Morrison's eyes flickered between Victoria and Dominic, noting how close they stood. We'll monitor him closely in the ICU. You should prepare yourselves. This could be a long journey." After Dr. Morrison left, Victoria turned to Dominic. "The children. I need to tell them something. Let me handle the company today." Dominic squeezed her hand. "You focus on Emma and Nathan." Victoria nodded, gathering her coat. As she turned to leave, Dominic caught her arm. "Vic, he's strong. He'll pull through." She met his eyes, something unspoken passing between them. "Yes, he always does." Neither of them noticed Rebecca Torres watching from down the hall, her private investigator's instincts triggered by their body language. She'd come as soon as she heard about Alex's accident, but something about Victoria and Dominic's interaction made her pause. After 15 years of friendship with all of them, she developed a sixth sense for deception. As Victoria disappeared into the elevator, Rebecca watched Dominic pull out his phone and make a call, speaking too quietly to hear. His expression was grim, determined, not the look of a man worried about his best friend's survival. Rebecca pulled out her own phone and made a note. After years of working cases involving infidelity and corporate espionage, she learned to trust her instincts. Something wasn't right, and Alex Sterling deserved to know what it was, if he ever woke up. The steady beep of heart monitors provided a rhythmic backdrop to Victoria Sterling's heels clicking against the hospital floor. 2 weeks had passed since the accident, and Alex remained unresponsive in the ICU. She paused outside his room, checking her reflection in the window, perfect makeup concealing the signs of sleepless nights. "Mrs. Sterling." Dr. Morrison approached, tablet in hand. "I was hoping to catch you. There are some promising signs in Alex's latest scans." Victoria's smile didn't quite reach her eyes. "That's wonderful news. Though given the circumstances, perhaps we should discuss long-term care options." "Long-term care?" Dr. Morrison frowned. "It's still quite early for that discussion. Many COMA patients." Dr. Victoria cut in smoothly. "I appreciate your optimism, but we need to be realistic. Alex wouldn't want extraordinary measures taken. He was always very clear about that." Dr. Morrison studied Victoria carefully. "I don't see anything in his medical directives about limiting care. In fact, there you are." Dominic Walsh's voice interrupted them as he strode down the hallway. "Victoria, we need to discuss the board meeting." Dr. Morrison watched them retreat to the family consultation room, her suspicion growing. She'd been treating patients long enough to recognize when something was off. Opening her tablet, she began documenting the conversation, a practice she'd started the day Alex was admitted. Inside the consultation room, Victoria locked the door while Dominic closed the blinds. Their professional demeanor melted away as soon as they were alone. "The key loggers?" Victoria asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Dominic pulled out his phone, showing her a screen full of passwords and access codes. "Everything. Personal accounts, company systems, even his private servers." Alex always was paranoid about security, but he never suspected his own CFO. "And the board? 3 members already support the emergency sale. 2 more are wavering. Once I show them the evidence of company instability, they'll fall in line." Dominic's smile was predatory. "The competitor's offer is ready, $70 million, with $10 million in guaranteed consulting contracts for the current management team." Victoria ran her fingers along his tie. "You always were better with numbers than Alex. He was too focused on his precious security protocols to see the bigger picture." Speaking of protocols, Dominic pulled away slightly, ever conscious of their surroundings. "The offshore transfers are ready. As CFO, I can authorize them as legitimate business operations. By the time anyone realizes what's happened, we'll be gone." Victoria's eyes gleamed. "What about the children? Emma and Nathan complicate things. They're old enough to ask questions." Dominic's expression hardened. "Are you sure about this part of the plan? They need closure to move on." Victoria's voice was steel wrapped in silk. "A funeral will give them that. You've seen how they are waiting, hoping it's cruel to let them live like this. The funeral home is arranged. closed casket, given the severity of injuries. Dominic checked his phone again. Rebecca Torres has been asking questions. She stopped by the office yesterday, wanting to review security footage from the past few months. Victoria tensed. She suspects something. Impossible to prove anything. I've been careful, but we should accelerate our timeline. He showed her another document on his phone. The power of attorney paperwork is ready. We just need to establish a pattern of mental deterioration before the accident. Leave that to me. Victoria straightened her blazer. I've already spoken to his personal assistant about some concerning behavior she witnessed. A few more similar statements from carefully chosen employees. A knock at the door interrupted them. Dr. Morrison's voice came through. Mrs. Sterling, the physical therapist needs to see you about Alex's treatment plan. They quickly separated, resuming their masks of concerned wife and supportive friend. But Dr. Morrison caught the way they avoided eye contact as they left the room. How their bodies angled away from each other. Subtle tells that years of observing human behavior had taught her to notice. That evening, Victoria called Emma and Nathan into the living room of their Beacon Hill home. They sat on the leather sofa, still in their school uniforms, while she perched on the edge of the coffee table before them. There's something we need to discuss about your father. She began, her voice gentle but firm. The doctors, they've done everything they can. Emma, 14 and sharp like her father, immediately stiffened. What do you mean? Dad's getting better. You said, sweetheart. Victoria reached for her daughter's hand. Sometimes people's bodies keep going even when they're already gone. The doctors say your father's brain damage was too severe. He's not coming back to us. Nathan, 12 and quieter than his sister, began to cry silently. Emma pulled her hand away from Victoria's grasp. You're lying. Emma's voice shook. I want to see him. I want to talk to his doctors. The damage to his body is extensive. Victoria continued smoothly. It wouldn't be right for you to see him like that. We need to remember him as he was. Uncle Dom will be here soon, she added. Standing up, he's going to help us with the arrangements. We need to be strong for each other now. Emma watched her mother leave the room, her young mind registering details she couldn't quite process. How Victoria's grief seemed rehearsed. The way she kept checking her phone. The subtle scent of unfamiliar cologne that clung to her clothes. In his private office across town, Dominic Walsh was putting the final touches on their plan. Multiple screens showed company financials, transfer authorizations, and encrypted communications with overseas accounts. A photo of him and Alex from their college graduation sat on his desk. Alex's arm around his shoulders, both of them grinning at the camera. Dominic picked up the frame, studying it for a moment before dropping it into his shredder. The machine's grinding seemed to echo his words to Victoria earlier that day. No loose ends. The morning of the funeral dawned clear and cool. Victoria had chosen Mount Auburn Cemetery for its prestigious reputation and, more importantly, its strict privacy policies. The closed mahogany caskets sat at the front of the private chapel, surrounded by carefully selected flowers. No lilies. Alex had been allergic, a detail Victoria remembered to maintain their charade. Emma and Nathan sat in the front row, both in new black clothes that still carried department store creases. Emma's face was a mask of barely contained rage, while Nathan seemed to have retreated into himself, his fingers constantly twisting the programming watch his father had given him for his last birthday. Your father would be proud of how brave you're being, Dominic said, sitting down beside them. He'd been a constant presence over the past week, sleeping in the guest room to help the family through this difficult time. Emma turned her head away from him. Did they ever find his phone or his laptop? Sweetheart, they were destroyed in the accident. Victoria answered quickly from Emma's other side. Why do you ask? No reason. Emma's tone was flat, but her mind was racing. Her father had taught her enough about technology to know that devices could be tracked, that data could be recovered. He'd made his fortune protecting people's digital secrets. Surely he had protected his own. The service was brief, with carefully chosen speakers who knew not to deviate from the approved narrative. Victoria delivered a widow's eulogy that brought tears to many eyes, though Rebecca Torres, watching from the back row, noticed how Victoria's handkerchief never quite touched her face. As the empty casket was lowered into the ground, Rebecca's trained eye caught other discrepancies. The funeral director seemed uncertain when handling the casket, as if compensating for unexpected weight or lack thereof. Dominic's hand lingered too long on Victoria's lower back when he thought no one was watching. And most telling, Dr. Morrison was conspicuously absent despite being Alex's primary physician. After the service, mourners gathered at the Sterling home. Victoria had arranged catering from Alex's favorite restaurant, another carefully orchestrated detail. Emma and Nathan were instructed to stay upstairs, their mother claiming they needed rest. "It's for the best," Victoria explained to concerned relatives. Children process grief differently. They need space. But Emma wasn't resting. She sat cross-legged on her bed, laptop open, trying every password combination she could think of to access her father's cloud storage. Nathan lay on the floor beside her bed, methodically taking apart and reassembling his watch. "He's not dead," Nathan said suddenly, his voice small but certain. Emma paused her typing. "What makes you say that?" "Dad always said that in his business, you trust patterns and data, not what people tell you." Nathan didn't look up from his watch. "Mom's patterns are wrong. Uncle Dom's patterns are wrong." A knock at the door interrupted them. Rebecca Torres entered, closing the door quietly behind her. She'd always been their favorite of their parents' friends, teaching them card tricks and letting them play with her investigation equipment. "Your father," Rebecca said without preamble, keeping her voice low, "was one of the most cautious men I've ever met when it came to security. He wouldn't have left himself vulnerable." Emma's eyes widened. "You don't believe he's dead either?" "I believe that questions without answers deserve investigation." Rebecca glanced at the door. "Keep watching. Keep listening. But most importantly, keep pretending." After Rebecca left, Emma opened a new document on her laptop. At the top, she typed questions about Dad's death and began listing every inconsistency she'd noticed. Meanwhile, downstairs, Victoria and Dominic were meeting with Alex's corporate attorney in the study. The power of attorney paperwork sat on the desk between them, awaiting final signatures. "Mrs. Sterling, are you certain about this?" The attorney frowned at the documents. "The timeline seems unusually accelerated. My husband's mental state had been deteriorating for months before the accident." Victoria's voice trembled perfectly. "The board needs strong leadership now. Dominic understands Alex's vision better than anyone. There are several large transactions pending." Dominic added smoothly, "time-sensitive deals that could affect the company's survival. Alex would want us to protect his legacy." As they talked, Dr. Morrison was making her own documentation in her office at Massachusetts General. She carefully noted every conversation, every request about terminating care, every inconsistency in Victoria and Dominic's behavior. Years of medical practice had taught her to trust her instincts about family dynamics, and everything about this situation felt wrong. Her pager buzzed. Alex's night shift nurse needed her. Hurrying to the ICU, she found Nurse James Carter standing over Alex's bed, checking readings on the monitors. "Dr. Morrison," James spoke quietly, "I think you should see this." He played back the last hour's worth of brain activity readings. Dr. Morrison studied the patterns, her breath catching. The readings showed subtle but distinct variations, patterns that suggested potential conscious responses to stimuli. "How long have you been seeing these changes?" she asked James, keeping her voice low despite the private room. 3 days, James replied. "I've been running extra tests during my shifts." "Watch this." He gently touched Alex's hand while checking his vitals. The brain activity readings showed a slight but noticeable spike. "Document everything," Dr. Morrison instructed. "But keep this between us for now. Something about this situation isn't right, and I don't want to alert anyone until we're certain." James nodded, understanding the unspoken concern. He'd been a nurse for 20 years and had developed a sixth sense about family dynamics. Victoria and Dominic's late-night visits, their whispered conversations when they thought no one was around. The way they'd react with barely concealed disappointment to news of Alex's stable condition. It all felt wrong. Later that evening, Victoria returned to the hospital alone. She stood by Alex's bed, her designer purse placed carefully on the visitor's chair. "Oh, Alex," she sighed, but there was no tenderness in her voice, always so strong, so in control. "Did you ever imagine it would end like this? That everything you built would slip right through your fingers?" She checked her phone. A message from Dominic confirmed that the first phase of corporate fund transfers was complete. Another message showed confirmation of the life insurance policy modifications she'd arranged months ago. "The children miss you," she continued, maintaining her act in case anyone was within earshot. "Emma's been asking questions. She's too much like you for her own good. But don't worry. Dominic and I will make sure they're taken care of." In the hallway, Miguel Ramirez, the night security guard, paused during his rounds. Something about Victoria Sterling had always set off his warning instincts. 25 years in hospital security had taught him to read people, and her grief never quite reached her eyes. He watched through the window as she made a phone call, her back to the door. Her posture changed completely, shoulders relaxing, voice taking on a warmer tone that never appeared when she spoke to the hospital staff. "Everything's proceeding as planned," she spoke softly into the phone. "The board meeting is tomorrow, once the sale is approved." "Yes, I know. No loose ends." Miguel made a mental note to review the security footage from Victoria's visits. In his experience, people who talked about no loose ends were usually hiding something worth finding. Across town, Rebecca Torres sat in her darkened office, surrounded by monitors displaying surveillance footage from Sterling Shield's offices. She'd managed to access the building's security systems. Alex himself had helped design them, and she knew how he thought. The footage showed Dominic working late into the night, accessing servers that had nothing to do with his role as CFO. Multiple screens showed him moving through restricted areas of the building, using access codes that should have been above his clearance level. Rebecca's phone buzzed. A text from Emma. "Found something in Dad's old emails. Can we meet tomorrow?" She replied carefully. "Museum after school. Bring Nathan." A new email alert caught her attention. One of her contacts in corporate security had found something interesting. Victoria Sterling had recently modified Alex's life insurance policy, increasing the payout and adding specific clauses about permanent disability. The timing of the changes, just 2 months before Alex's accident, set off every alarm bell in Rebecca's investigator instincts. In their bedroom at home, Emma and Nathan sat huddled over their father's old tablet. They'd finally cracked one of his backup passwords, a combination of their birth dates and his college dorm room number. "Look at this." Emma pointed to an email thread from 6 months ago. Dad was investigating something. He found irregular access patterns in the company's development servers. Nathan, who'd inherited his father's gift for patterns, studied the technical logs. "These IP addresses, they're not from the office network. Someone was accessing things remotely." "Kids," Victoria's voice called from downstairs. "It's late. You should be in bed." They quickly hid the tablet and turned off their lights, but sleep wouldn't come easily. Both children lay awake, their minds racing with questions. Their father had taught them to trust data over emotions, to look for patterns and chaos, and every pattern they found pointed to one inescapable conclusion. The story of their father's death was built on lies. In his hospital room, Alex Sterling lay motionless, surrounded by the quiet beeping of monitors. But behind his closed eyes, his mind was anything but quiet. Years of disciplined thinking had created neural pathways that even trauma couldn't fully disrupt. On some deep level, he was aware of the conversations around him, of the betrayal unfolding in his name. Dr. Morrison made one final check before ending her shift. She updated her private notes, documenting every detail of the day's observations. Her instincts told her that Alex Sterling was still there, fighting his way back to consciousness. And when he did wake up, he would need allies who knew the truth. She turned off the office lights and locked her notes in a secure drawer. Tomorrow would bring more questions, more observations, more pieces of a puzzle she was determined to solve. Because if there was one thing Isabella Morrison had learned in her years of medicine, it was that the human will to survive could overcome almost anything, including betrayal by those you trusted most. The steady rhythm of medical monitors marked time in Alex Sterling's hospital room. Months had passed since the accident, and the world believed Alexander Sterling was little more than an empty shell, kept alive by machines, and his wife's supposed dedication. Nurse James Carter adjusted the IV drip during his night shift, his movements deliberate and precise. He'd been watching the subtle changes in Alex's condition for weeks. Microscopic twitches of fingers, slight variations in breathing patterns when certain voices entered the room. "Mr. Sterling," James spoke quietly while checking vitals. "If you can hear me, you're safe right now. It's just us." Alex's right index finger moved. Not a random twitch, but a deliberate tap. James had been a nurse for 20 years, long enough to recognize the difference between involuntary movements and conscious attempts at communication. "One tap for yes, two for no," James whispered, keeping his eyes on the monitors. "Are you fully conscious?" A single firm tap. James maintained his professional composure, but his mind raced. He'd suspected this for days, ever since he'd noticed how Alex's heart rate changed whenever Victoria or Dominic entered the room. Not the peaceful reaction of someone hearing loved ones, but the elevated response of prey-sensing predators. "I need to tell Dr. Morrison," James said, making notes in the chart. "She's been protecting you. We've all seen through their act." Another single tap. Over the next few weeks, James and Dr. Morrison worked in careful synchronization during day shifts. Dr. Morrison ran tests that seemed routine, but actually documented Alex's increasing consciousness. At night, James helped Alex with subtle exercises to maintain muscle tone while appearing comatose. "Your wife and Dominic were here earlier," James informed Alex during one night shift. "They were discussing funeral arrangements. Despite your obvious improvements," Alex's jaw clenched a minute movement. But James caught it. He pulled out his phone and played a recording. Victoria's voice filled the quiet room. "The insurance company is getting suspicious about the extended care. We need to move forward with the terminal care discussions." Dominic's response was equally cold. "The company sale is almost complete. Once the Chinese buyers transfer the final payment for the IP rights, we can proceed with the next phase." James watched Alex's face. Even through months of muscle atrophy, he could see the man's expression harden. The monitors showed his heart rate and blood pressure rising. "Easy," James cautioned. "You need to maintain the facade. I've been documenting everything." He pulled out a small USB drive. "Security footage, conversations, their visits, it's all here. Miguel and security have been helping me compile it." Alex's eyes opened just slightly, fixing James with a stare of pure steel. The nurse had seen many expressions in his years of healthcare, but never such concentrated, controlled fury. During physical therapy sessions, carefully scheduled when Victoria and Dominic were known to be busy, Alex made remarkable progress. Dr. Morrison supervised personally, ensuring no other staff members were present. "Your muscle tone is returning faster than expected," Dr. Morrison noted, helping Alex grip a stress ball. "But we need to be cautious. They've been pushing hard for transfer to a long-term care facility." Alex squeezed the ball with surprising strength. Dr. Morrison checked the corridor before leaning closer. "Rebecca Torres came by last week," she whispered. "She's been investigating independently. Your children, they're asking questions too. Emma especially, she's like you. Sees through the deception." At the mention of his children, Alex's grip tightened until his knuckles whitened. Dr. Morrison watched the monitors spike. "They're safe," she assured him. "But your wife, she's moved Dominic into your house. They're telling everyone he's helping the family cope. The stress ball burst in Alex's grip. Later that night, James helped Alex with more intensive exercises. The patient's recovery was remarkable, a testament to iron will and focused determination. Victoria and Dominic were laughing in the hallway earlier. James said, supporting Alex as he tensed and relaxed his core muscles. I recorded them. They were discussing plans for their new beach house in Cape Cod. Bought with your money, I assume. Alex's eyes opened fully this time. James held up his phone, showing security footage of Victoria and Dominic by the nurse's station, their body language intimate and casual. They looked like a couple celebrating good fortune, not mourners tending to a critically ill loved one. The board approved the company's sale yesterday, James continued, helping Alex sit up slightly. Dominic announced it as an emergency measure to protect shareholder value. The official story is that your condition left the company vulnerable. Alex's hand gripped James's arm with surprising strength. His eyes conveyed what his voice couldn't yet express, a promise of retribution that made the nurse glad he was on the right side of this situation. Through careful observation and gradual testing, James and Dr. Morrison established a secure routine. Alex remained apparently comatose when Victoria or Dominic visited, but worked relentlessly on his recovery during their absence. Dr. Morrison kept detailed records of every suspicious conversation, every inconsistency in Victoria and Dominic's behavior. She documented their push for terminal care despite clear signs of improvement, their attempts to limit access to Alex's medical records, their increasing urgency to transfer him to a facility where they'd have more control. Your wife filed updated power of attorney papers, Dr. Morrison informed Alex during one therapy session. Claims you showed signs of mental deterioration before the accident. But her documentation is thin. We can fight it. Alex managed to whisper, his voice rough from months of disuse. Let them think they're winning. It was the first full sentence he'd spoken since awakening. Dr. Morrison and James exchanged glances, recognizing the dangerous edge in those 4 words. This wasn't a patient focused on recovery. This was a predator gathering strength for the hunt. As weeks passed, Alex's progress accelerated. Working with James during night shifts, he regained enough strength to sit up, to grip objects, to write brief notes. Every movement was calculated, every improvement hidden from his would-be conspirators. James brought news from outside. How Victoria had redecorated the Beacon Hill house, how Dominic had taken over Alex's office at Sterling Shield, how they'd barely maintained a pretense of grief in public anymore. Your daughter Emma, James reported one night. She came by last week when Victoria wasn't here. Stood outside your door for an hour. Security cameras caught her trying to hack the door's keypad. A ghost of a smile crossed Alex's face, the first James had seen. It wasn't a pleasant expression. Through security footage, James had secretly preserved. Alex watched months of betrayal unfold on a tablet screen. Victoria and Dominic's evolution from maintaining appearances to flaunting their relationship. Their discussions with funeral directors, despite his improvement. Their laughter, their triumph, their complete confidence in their plan's success. Alex absorbed every detail, every gesture, every word. His expression remained neutral, but James noticed how the tablet's case cracked under his strengthening grip. My children. Rebecca's been watching them. Gabriel's voice softened slightly. Emma's been investigating on her own. Smart kid. Nathan's withdrawn, but he's been writing code, trying to break into Sterling Shield's backup servers. They suspect something's wrong. A brief nod acknowledged both his children's resilience and the pain of their separation. But Alex had learned in business that emotion without action was wasteful. Every feeling needed to be converted into tactical advantage. Rebecca's latest report arrived encrypted on a secure laptop. Alex read through her findings while Gabriel made calls to his legal contacts. Victoria is trying to adopt the children as a single parent. Rebecca had written claiming your death left them without a father, but Emma's refusing to sign the paperwork. There was more surveillance photos showing Victoria and Dominic growing increasingly careless and public. They'd bought a beach house on Cape Cod with stolen funds. We're planning trips to countries without extradition treaties. They think they've won, Alex said quietly. That's their weakness. Gabriel looked up from his phone. Federal investigators are interested in the intellectual property theft angle. Sterling Shield's encryption protocols were classified as crucial to national security. Selling them to Chinese front companies is treason. Alex finished. His voice carried no emotion, just cold certainty. What else did Rebecca find? Gabriel pulled out another file. The board meeting recordings are particularly damning. Dominic fabricated financial reports, presented false evidence of company instability. But he got cocky, didn't clean up his digital trails. Alex moved to the table, each step measured and controlled. Physical therapy had restored his strength, but he maintained the deliberate movement patterns developed during his hospital deception. Every action now was calculated, considered. "Show me the company's server's access logs," he commanded. Rebecca had compiled months of digital evidence. Dominic's login credentials accessing restricted areas. Victoria's personal device connecting to secure servers. Systematic dismantling of security protocols Alex had personally designed. They used my own systems to destroy what I built. Alex noted, his tone clinical appropriate, that those same systems will now document their crimes. Gabriel spread more photos across the table. Victoria and Dominic at restaurants, social events, barely maintaining the pretense of grief, their timeline of betrayal laid out in high-resolution detail. The hospital staff have been incredibly helpful. Gabriel added Dr. Morrison's records, James's security footage, Miguel's observation logs. They'd given us a complete narrative of their attempts to end your life support. Alex studied each piece of evidence methodically. Months of enforced stillness had taught him to direct his rage into focused analysis. Every document, every photo, every record was a weapon waiting to be deployed. Rebecca's latest surveillance report. Gabriel handed over a sealed envelope. "You should know Victoria's been pressuring Emma about the adoption papers. Your daughter threw them in the fireplace." A brief flicker of pride crossed Alex's face. She seized the patterns. "Like I taught her, Nathan's been quieter, but Rebecca caught him trying to access the hospital security archives. The kids aren't buying the story anymore." Alex's hand stilled over the documents. "Have they been compromised?" "No. Victoria and Dominic are too focused on securing their positions. They've dismissed the children's suspicions as grief responses." Gabriel's lip curled slightly. "Their arrogance is our advantage." The evidence painted a comprehensive picture. Victoria and Dominic had planned meticulously but executed sloppily. Their confidence in Alex's incapacitation had led them to take risks, leave traces, speak too freely. The cryptocurrency transfers. Alex pointed to a transaction record. These patterns, Rebecca traced them through multiple shells. They thought using Chinese exchanges would hide their tracks. But the timestamps correlate perfectly with the company's IP sales. Alex nodded. His wife and best friend had used his own technological innovations to betray him. They'd forgotten who had designed those systems, who had built in backdoors and monitoring protocols they'd never noticed. "What about the private facility they tried to transfer me to?" Gabriel's expression hardened. "Owned by a shell company connected to Victoria's college roommate. We found evidence of previous accidents involving wealthy patients. Local police are very interested." Each piece of evidence strengthened their case. Financial fraud, corporate espionage, attempted wrongdoing, international technology theft. Victoria and Dominic had built a comprehensive framework for their own destruction. "They've been thorough," Alex noted, reviewing hospital security logs, recording their own confessions every time they visited my room. "Thinking I couldn't hear, couldn't understand, couldn't fight back." The logs showed everything. Their discussions of funeral arrangements while he was improving, their plans for the children's future, their celebrations of successful theft dressed up as grief. "The life insurance investigation is particularly interesting," Gabriel added. Rebecca found connections between the truck driver's family and offshore accounts linked to Dominic. They left a clear money trail. Alex absorbed each detail, building a mental map of betrayal and evidence. His expression remained neutral, but Gabriel recognized the focused intensity of a predator studying prey patterns. The federal investigators, Alex said finally, they have enough to move forward. More than enough, the national security implications of the IP theft alone. Gabriel gathered the documents carefully, but they're willing to wait, build a stronger case, make it airtight. Alex stood, moving to the window. His reflection showed a man transformed, not weakened by betrayal, but tempered by it. Every fragment of evidence was a blade being sharpened. Every discovery, a weapon being primed. Keep building the case, he instructed. Let them think they've won completely. When we move, they need to be at their most vulnerable. Gabriel nodded, understanding the strategy. Victoria and Dominic's greatest weakness was their belief in their own victory. Each day of apparent success made them more careless, more exposed. Rebecca will maintain surveillance, Gabriel confirmed. Dr. Morrison and the hospital staff will preserve every record. Your children are safe, watched over by people they don't even know are protecting them. Alex's response was simple. Good. The cabin's isolation had served its purpose. He had regained his strength, gathered his evidence, confirmed his allies. Victoria and Dominic thought they were writing the end of Alexander Sterling's story. They didn't realize they were only setting the stage for their own destruction. Every piece of evidence was a domino placed precisely, waiting for the perfect moment to begin their fall. The sun set behind the Berkshire Mountains as Alex reviewed the files one final time. The case was built, the evidence secured. All that remained was choosing the perfect moment to strike. Gabriel watched his old friend's methodical preparation, grateful to be an ally rather than an enemy. The Alexander Sterling who had awakened in that hospital bed was gone, replaced by something far more dangerous, a man with nothing left to lose and everything to reclaim. The betrayers would learn too late that they hadn't buried Alexander Sterling. They'd simply forced him to evolve into something far more lethal than they could have imagined. Victoria Walsh, she'd taken to using Dominic's surname unofficially, sat at her mahogany desk in the Beacon Hill house, reviewing adoption paperwork. The process of legally separating her children from their father's name had proven more challenging than expected, primarily due to Emma's continued resistance. Her phone buzzed. Another email. She clicked it without thinking, then froze. The video began playing automatically, footage from Alex's hospital room. Her own voice filled the silence. The life support is just prolonging the inevitable. He wouldn't want this. The camera angle showed her hand on Dominic's thigh as they discussed ending her husband's life. More emails arrived in rapid succession. Each contained different footage, her and Dominic laughing after meeting with funeral directors, their intimate moments in hospital corridors, discussions about offshore accounts. The recipients list included her parents, Dominic's family, board members, close friends, everyone. Her phone rang. Victoria. Dominic's voice was tight. My office. Now, Sterling Shield's executive floor felt different. Employees who normally greeted her warmly now averted their eyes. She found Dominic staring at his computer screen, his face ashen. It's everywhere, he said without looking up. Every email server, every social media account. Someone even sent the hospital footage to my daughter's college address. Victoria gripped the back of his chair. How those security cameras were recording everything. Just like the keyloggers we used on Alex. His laugh was bitter. We're being played with our own tactics. His screen showed dozens of emails, each containing damning evidence, their careful plans, their secret meetings, their gradual dismantling of Alex's empire, all exposed with surgical precision. The board is demanding an emergency meeting, Dominic continued. They've received documentation suggesting the company's sale was fraudulent. Victoria's phone buzzed again. This time it was Emma found the videos. Guess you and Uncle Dom were really broken up about Dad. Huh. Before she could respond, another message arrived from Dr. Morrison's office. The power of attorney was being challenged. There would be a hearing in 3 days. Someone's coordinating this. Dominic paced the office. The timing, the distribution, the targets. This isn't random exposure. This is psychological warfare. Victoria stared at her phone as more notifications arrived. Their carefully constructed narrative was unraveling thread by thread. Every person they deceived was receiving tailored evidence of their betrayal. The adoption paperwork, she suddenly remembered. If they're challenging the power of attorney, they'll challenge everything. Dominic pulled up their banking app. We need to move the offshore accounts now. But when he tried to access their hidden funds, the account showed pending investigations. Every transaction, every transfer was being scrutinized. Rebecca Torres watched this unfold from her surveillance position across the street. Through high-powered microphones, she recorded their panic, their desperate attempts to contain the damage. Her phone buzzed. A message from Alex. Phase 1 complete. Begin Phase 2. At the Berkshire cabin, Alex sat surrounded by monitors, each showing different aspects of his revenge unfolding. Gabriel Hayes stood beside him, coordinating with legal teams. Dr. Morrison's records have been submitted to the court, Gabriel reported. Her documentation of their attempts to terminate life support despite signs of improvement is devastating. The judge has scheduled an emergency hearing. Alex nodded, his expression unchanging as he watched Victoria and Dominic's world crumble. The children. Emma's already submitted a statement opposing the adoption. Nathan's withdrawn his consent. The family court judge is very interested in why they were told you were dead while you were actually improving. Through careful coordination with Dr. Morrison, Alex had already begun rebuilding his relationship with his children. Private therapy sessions, carefully documented meetings, gradual exposure to the truth, all laying groundwork for what was to come. The board members, falling over themselves to cooperate with investigators. Once they saw evidence of how Victoria and Dominic manipulated company valuations, they realized they were potentially liable. Alex's fingers moved across his keyboard, triggering the next phase of exposures. Employee emails began receiving documentation of Victoria and Dominic's systematic dismantling of company security. Clients learned how their data had been compromised. Shareholders discovered evidence of deliberate devaluation. They'll try to run. Alex noted, watching through surveillance feeds as Victoria and Dominic grew increasingly frantic. Let them think they still have options. Rebecca's next report arrived. Victoria had called her private banker in Geneva. Dominic was researching flights to non-extradition countries. Their panic was making them predictable. In their Beacon Hill home, Emma and Nathan sat in Emma's room, watching the chaos unfold on their devices. The truth about their father, the evidence of betrayal, the carefully preserved hospital footage. It all confirmed what they'd suspected but couldn't prove. He's alive, Emma whispered, replaying a clip of Victoria and Dominic discussing funeral arrangements, while hospital monitors showed improving vital signs. He was alive the whole time. Nathan, who'd been silently coding for months, looked up from his laptop. The IP addresses sending these emails, they're bouncing through our old server protocols. The ones Dad designed. The psychological impact was precisely what Alex had calculated. Every person Victoria and Dominic had deceived was now an active participant in their downfall. Their social circles, their professional networks, their own families, all turned against them by the weight of evidence. Dr. Morrison arrived at court with boxes of documentation. Every conversation, every suspicious request, every attempt to transfer Alex despite improvement, all meticulously recorded and witnessed. The power of attorney was obtained through fraud, she testified. They deliberately misrepresented his condition to gain control of his assets, while actively working to end his life support. The judge's reaction was swift. Victoria's power of attorney was immediately suspended pending criminal investigation. Emergency custody of the children was temporarily awarded to their maternal grandparents, who had just received video evidence of their daughter discussing ways to terminate their son-in-law's life support. In their office at Sterling Shield, Victoria and Dominic watched their carefully constructed world dissolve. Board members resigned to avoid liability. Clients terminated contracts. Banks froze accounts pending fraud investigations. "Someone knows everything," Dominic muttered, trying another offshore account only to find it locked. "Someone's been watching us from the beginning." Victoria stared at her phone, now flooding with messages from people she called friends. The hospital footage was particularly damaging. Her lack of grief, her intimate moments with Dominic, her aggressive attempts to end Alex's care despite his improvement. "The children," she said suddenly. "We need to secure the children before." But Emma and Nathan were already gone, safely ensconced with their grandparents under court order. Their devices contained copies of every damning piece of evidence, every betrayal, every lie. Alex watched through surveillance feeds as his wife and best friend's lives imploded. Each revelation was precisely timed, each exposure calculated for maximum impact. This wasn't just revenge, it was decimation. The psychological warfare he'd unleash was more effective than any direct confrontation. Victoria and Dominic's own actions, caught on camera and preserved in digital records, were destroying them more thoroughly than any accusation could. Gabriel's phone buzzed with updates from various courts. "The judges have seen enough. Criminal investigations are opening. They'll be lucky to avoid prison." Alex's expression remained neutral, but his eyes held the cold satisfaction of a predator watching prey exhaust themselves. They haven't begun to understand their luck yet. The Sterling Shield boardroom buzzed with tension as federal investigators laid out their evidence. Dominic sat at the head of the table, a position he'd stolen from Alex, watching years of careful planning crumble under the weight of documented fraud. The intellectual property sale to Chinese entities violated national security protocols, the lead investigator stated, sliding documents across the polished table. The cryptocurrency transactions attempting to hide the proceeds have been traced. Victoria, seated beside Dominic, maintained her composed facade, but her fingers trembled as she reviewed the evidence. Complete blockchain records showing how they'd attempted to hide millions through digital currencies. "We have documentation of systematic corporate espionage," another agent continued. "Unauthorized access to classified systems, deliberate compromise of security protocols, sale of protected technologies to foreign competitors." The board members, already distancing themselves from the scandal, watched in silent horror as the scope of liability became clear. Their hasty approval of the emergency sale had exposed them to potential criminal charges. Rebecca Torres observed from her position as a consultant to the investigation. Her surveillance over the past months had laid the groundwork for this moment. Every transaction, every meeting, every attempt to hide their theft, all meticulously documented and now being presented with devastating effect. Dominic attempted damage control. These transactions were approved through proper channels. Channels you accessed using fraudulent power of attorney. The investigator cut in. "We have evidence of systematic manipulation of Mr. Sterling's authentication protocols before his accident." The evidence was overwhelming. Keylogger logs showing how they'd stolen Alex's credentials. Server access records documenting the gradual theft of company assets. Offshore account transfers timed to coincide with fabricated board approvals. Victoria's phone buzzed. Her private banker in Geneva informing her that all accounts were frozen pending international investigation. The millions they'd hidden through cryptocurrency transactions were being systematically traced and seized. The life insurance investigation is particularly interesting, an investigator noted, opening another file. Multiple policies taken out months before Mr. Sterling's accident, with specific riders for permanent disability or death. The boardroom grew colder as more evidence emerged. Documentation of meetings with the truck driver's family. Phone records showing calls to mechanics who'd worked on the brake lines. Financial transfers that painted a picture of premeditated wrongdoing. In his secure location, Alex coordinated with Gabriel's legal team. Each piece of evidence had been carefully preserved, each revelation timed for maximum impact. The federal investigation was merely one prong of his systematic destruction of their financial empire. The insurance companies have launched their own fraud investigations, Gabriel reported. They're cooperating fully with federal authorities. Victoria and Dominic's attempts to access the policy funds only created more evidence. Alex watched through secure feeds as his wife and former friend attempted to salvage their crumbling finances. Each account they tried to access triggered new fraud alerts. Every attempt to move money generated more documentation of their crimes. Sterling Shield stock is in freefall, Gabriel continued. The board's emergency meeting to remove Dominic is scheduled for tomorrow. The company's assets are being frozen to prevent further theft. Victoria and Dominic's desperation grew as their options disappeared. Their attempts to access hidden funds only led investigators to more accounts. We're trying to liquidate personal assets, Rebecca reported via secure channel. But the forensic accountants are flagging everything. Even their legitimate accounts are being scrutinized. The financial destruction was total. Properties bought with stolen funds were seized. Investment accounts were frozen. Credit cards were canceled as evidence of fraud mounted. In their Beacon Hill home, purchased with Alex's money, Victoria and Dominic faced the reality of their situation. Their phones buzzed constantly with notifications of frozen accounts, pending investigations, and asset seizures. How did they trace everything? Dominic demanded, attempting another cryptocurrency transfer only to find the wallet locked. These accounts were supposed to be untraceable. Victoria stared at her bank statements, watching their stolen fortune disappear into frozen accounts and legal holds. Someone knew our plans. Someone's been 10 steps ahead this whole time. The federal investigation expanded hourly. International financial authorities cooperated to track every hidden account, every attempt to transfer. The evidence trail Victoria and Dominic had created in their overconfidence now led directly to proof of their crimes. Alex's revenge was methodical, comprehensive, and completely legal. He wasn't just taking back what they'd stolen. He was ensuring they'd never have the resources to recover. The Chinese buyers are being investigated for industrial espionage, Gabriel reported. They're already offering to cooperate in exchange for leniency. Everyone involved is scrambling to save themselves. The financial destruction wasn't merely about money. Each revelation destroyed Victoria and Dominic's credibility, their social standing, their ability to find allies. Their wealth had bought them influence. Now its loss left them isolated. Rebecca's surveillance captured their growing panic. Victoria attempting to access emergency funds only to find accounts frozen. Dominic discovering his trading accounts suspended pending fraud investigation. Their desperate calls to lawyers who suddenly wouldn't represent them. The life insurance investigation proved particularly damaging. Companies don't look kindly on policies taken out just before suspicious accidents. Victoria's aggressive attempts to claim benefits while Alex was improving in the hospital created a clear pattern of fraud. They're completely exposed, Gabriel summarized. Every financial move they make creates more evidence. Every attempt to access hidden funds proves criminal intent. Alex nodded, watching through secure feeds as his betrayer's financial empire crumbled. Let them feel what it's like to lose everything they thought was secure. The federal investigation moved with surprising speed, aided by the mountain of evidence Alex's team had compiled. Bank records, blockchain transactions, board meeting minutes, altered documents, all combining to create an irrefutable case. Victoria and Dominic's attempts to protect themselves only made things worse. Their panic financial moves created new evidence trails. Their desperate attempts to access hidden funds led investigators to more accounts. The company sale is being unwound, Gabriel reported. The board is cooperating fully, trying to avoid personal liability. The Chinese buyers are facing their own investigations. Alex's expression remained impassive as he monitored the destruction of his betrayer's financial world. This wasn't just revenge. It was annihilation of everything they'd stolen, everything they tried to build on the ruins of his life. The federal investigators worked methodically through the evidence, each discovery leading to new charges. Corporate espionage, wire fraud, attempted wrongdoing for insurance fraud. The list grew daily. Victoria and Dominic's world contracted as their resources disappeared. Property seized, accounts frozen, assets tied up in criminal investigations. They tried to bury Alexander Sterling. Instead, they dug their own graves. The message about the Cape Cod Beach House break-in reached Victoria and Dominic as they sat in their lawyer's office, reviewing the mounting evidence against them. Miguel Ramirez, the hospital security guard they barely remembered, called to report suspicious activity at their recently purchased property. This is our chance, Dominic decided, desperate for any distraction from their crumbling world. We can secure emergency funds I stored there. Enough to get us out of the country. They drove separately to maintain appearances, their phones buzzing constantly with notifications of new financial seizures, new investigations, new betrayals by former allies. The beach house represented their last hope. Emergency cash and documents hidden for exactly this type of crisis. The house stood dark against the evening sky. Victoria parked her Mercedes, one of the few assets not yet seized, in the circular driveway. Dominic arrived moments later, his expression tense. The security systems disabled, he noted, using his key to enter. The house was silent, but something felt wrong. The air held tension they couldn't identify. They moved through the darkened rooms toward Dominic's home office, where he'd hidden their emergency resources. Neither noticed the subtle movements of figures outside, the strategic positioning of vehicles on surrounding streets. The office door stood open. A lamp cast dim light over a familiar figure seated in Dominic's custom leather chair. "Hello, Victoria." "Dominic." Alex Sterling's voice carried no emotion. "Please come in. We have so much to discuss." Victoria's gasp caught in her throat. Dominic reached for a weapon that wasn't there. Alex remained seated, his posture relaxed, but his eyes held the cold focus of a predator. "Impossible," Victoria whispered. "You were comatose. Dead? Amazing what people can accomplish when everyone underestimates them." Alex's tone remained conversational. "Though I must thank you both. Your overconfidence made everything so much easier." Dominic found his voice. The hospital records were carefully maintained by Dr. Morrison, who documented every suspicious request you made, every attempt to end life support despite signs of improvement, every conversation about funeral arrangements while I was conscious and recovering. The magnitude of their miscalculation began to dawn. Every step they'd taken, every plan they'd made, had been observed and documented. "The company sale." Dominic's voice cracked slightly. "Being unwound as we speak. The board is quite cooperative now that they've seen evidence of your fraud. The Chinese buyers are facing their own investigations. Amazing how quickly loyalty shifts when federal charges loom." Victoria took a step forward. "Our children are no longer your concern." Alex's voice carried an edge that made her step back. "Though I'm curious, when exactly did you decide to tell them their father was dead? Before or after you moved your lover into my house?" Movement in the doorway drew their attention. Emma and Nathan stepped into the room, their expressions a mixture of anger and vindication. Victoria stumbled back while Dominic went pale. "Emma." "Nathan." Victoria reached toward them, but they moved closer to Alex. "You don't understand. We understand everything." Emma cut in. Her voice was steel, so like her father's. "We've seen the videos, the hospital footage, every conversation about killing Dad while he was getting better." Nathan's voice was quieter, but no less devastating. "You made us attend a funeral, an empty casket, while Dad was alive." Alex remained seated, watching his children deliver their own form of justice. They'd spent months in therapy processing the betrayal, understanding the magnitude of what their mother had done. Their presence here wasn't just for dramatic effect. It was closure. "The FBI has some questions," Alex noted casually. His agents began filing into the room about life insurance fraud, attempted wrongdoing, corporate espionage, international technology theft. The list is quite extensive. Victoria spun toward the door, but federal agents already blocked every exit. Dominic seemed to age years in moments, his empire of lies collapsing completely. "You can't prove," Dominic began. "Your own security cameras proved everything," Alex interrupted. "Every conversation in my hospital room. Every discussion of how to end my life. Every plan to steal my company. My children. My life." His voice remained steady, but his eyes promised consequences. "You recorded your own confessions, thinking I couldn't hear, couldn't understand, couldn't fight back." Rebecca Torres entered holding files. "The evidence is comprehensive. Financial records, surveillance footage, witness statements. Dr. Morrison's documentation alone would convince any jury." The truck driver's wife was particularly cooperative. Alex added, "Once federal agents explained the consequences of conspiracy to commit wrongdoing, she provided detailed records of your payments." Victoria's composure finally broke. "The children need me. The children need therapy to recover from your lies." Alex's voice cut like a blade. "Dr. Morrison has been quite helpful in documenting the psychological trauma of being forced to mourn a living father." FBI agents moved forward with handcuffs. The charges were read: conspiracy to commit wrongdoing, insurance fraud, corporate espionage, wire fraud, international technology theft, child endangerment. The list continued. As Victoria and Dominic were led away in handcuffs, Alex finally stood. His presence filled the room. No longer the comatose victim, but the architect of their destruction. "You tried to bury me," he said quietly. "You forgot that I build systems to protect against betrayal, that I planned for every contingency, that I never, ever forgive those who threaten what's mine." Emma and Nathan moved to their father's side, a family reunited through fire. The healing had taken months. Careful therapy sessions, gradual exposure to the truth, rebuilding trust shattered by betrayal. Outside, federal vehicles filled the street. Victoria and Dominic's carefully constructed world was dismantled piece by piece. Their assets seized, their freedom forfeit, their betrayal exposed to everyone they deceived. Rebecca approached Alex as the agents departed with their prisoners. Years of friendship had evolved into something deeper through their shared mission of justice. "Sterling Shield's intellectual property is being recovered," she reported. "The company will rebuild stronger than before." Alex nodded, one arm around each of his children. "They thought they could steal my life," he said quietly. "Instead, they just helped me create a better one." Dr. Morrison, James, and Miguel arrived to witness the final act of justice. Their loyalty during Alex's darkest hours had been rewarded with positions that utilized their protective instincts and attention to detail. Gabriel Hayes arrived last, bringing files from his latest court appearance. He'd become Sterling Shield's chief legal counsel, his ruthless approach to corporate law matching Alex's own unforgiving nature. The evidence they'd gathered still proved useful in preventing appeals and maintaining pressure on the conspirators. The Chinese executives who tried to buy our stolen technology. Gabriel settled into his usual chair. Their sentences were just extended. Turns out they were involved in other corporate espionage cases. The federal investigators send their regards. The dining room filled with conversation about recent successes and future plans. Emma discussed her research into quantum encryption. Nathan demonstrated his latest security application. The trauma that had once torn the family apart had instead forged stronger bonds. Rebecca's investigative skills and loyalty had helped create a new kind of family, bound by choice rather than blood. The monthly gatherings of those who had stood by Alex became celebrations of loyalty rewarded and betrayal defeated. Alex himself had evolved beyond revenge into something more powerful, a living reminder that betrayal carried consequences beyond imagination. His company protected others from the kind of theft he had faced. His family demonstrated how truth could triumph over deception. His success served as constant punishment to those who had tried to destroy him. The story of Alexander Sterling became more than revenge. It became a template for justice served through patience and precision. The betrayer's true punishment wasn't just prison, but watching helplessly as everything they tried to steal flourished without them. In their separate cells, Victoria and Dominic faced decades more of the same routine, each day bringing new evidence of their failure. Each month marked by that maddening dollar deposit, each year passing as the world forgot them while celebrating the man they tried to destroy. Their betrayal had aimed to bury Alexander Sterling. Instead, it had forged him and his loyal allies into something stronger, a family bound by choice, an empire built on truth, a legacy of justice served without mercy or forgiveness. The price of their betrayal wasn't measured just in years served or assets lost, but in the daily reminder that their elaborate scheme had achieved the opposite of its intention. They had tried to steal a life and fortune. Instead, they had sacrificed their own, becoming nothing more than a cautionary tale in the legend of Alexander Sterling's triumph. Every month, as that single dollar appeared in their commissary accounts, they remembered anew the fundamental lesson of their failure. Some betrayals carry consequences eternal as prison walls, cold as calculated revenge, and absolute as justice served through patience and precision. Thanks to everyone who took the time to listen to today's stories. If you enjoyed it, please consider liking and subscribing if you haven't already. Feel free to share your thoughts on the events in the comments below. Take care.